people are inherently treating their income differently and not realizing that, hey, RSUs is a significant portion of your compensation. If you're not treating it like income, you might just be doing nothing with it. They end up with huge concentrated positions where 50% of the net worth is tied up to stock in the company that they're actually physically working in right now. Diversification is very popular when stocks are tanking, but when things are increasing by 100% in the year, it's hard to convince them that they should be diversifying because they've benefited so much for doing nothing.
I think we all have that bomber fantasy of we just want to keep on concentrating.
Developers. Yes!
Welcome to the SVIC podcast, where we deliver tech insights without the hype. Join my co-host, Joe Trinaski, and me, Jordan Thibodeau, as we break down the latest in tech, cut through the hype, and host top industry guests for exclusive insights.
Good. How are y'all doing?
Good.
Doing good. Let's see. Great. Andre, thank you for joining. Super appreciate you coming on here.
No, absolutely.
I was recommended to Andre's work from another tech employee whose name escapes me because I'm a terrible person. And Andre has all these great posts on LinkedIn about Fang Fire and retiring early and whatnot. So maybe, Andre, can you give us a bit of your background, your story, and we can kind of go from there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks so much for having me on. So I am just a tech employee. So I've worked in tech for 15 years, 10 of those over at Meta. And then I was laid off in May of 2023. And one of the things that I realized after being laid off was, hey, I've been diligent enough in saving my money and taking advantage of all of the excellent benefits that we have from being in tech, particularly within the larger of the tech employees or larger of the tech companies, that I didn't need to immediately go back to work. And that's kind of my big thing that I write a lot about on Fangfire. It's all around just nailing the basics and not getting too complicated and just taking advantage of the benefits that we get within tech. And I see so many of my fellow tech workers with the same level of income as me, but just not being able to be in the same position, especially the ones that are even more senior. So I know my salary and how much I'm making. So I know everyone else that's director and above is making multiples of that. So the fact that they're in a position where they're not able to be confident in being able to weather a layoff or a big turbulent storm or just the overall drop in compensation that could come with a dropping tech market like we saw the last couple of years. Now it's been good, but the only certainty is that there's going to be some volatility. And I think that now we're seeing that again today with Meta pre-announcing that they're going to be a little bit more rigorous in their performance management, saying that there's going to cut another 5%. So I think that just kind of goes to the core of kind of what I'm all about, just helping people get confidence in their finances, particularly within tech workers. I'm just hyper focused among that audience because that's who I am. I'm not writing about what I've read in a book. It's all around, hey, this is my own personal experiences being a tech worker, being in the exact same shoes as many of the people that are reading what I write. I consider myself not retired right now because I have a partner who works. She's over at Uber. So I can't with a straight face say I'm retired, particularly because we have a 6-year-old child. So I'm a stay-at-home dad with a lot of extra free time while they're in school during the day and spending time on hobbies like this and really shifting over from doing things purely for a financial reason and more for like what gives me purpose. So that's my quick intro.
Well said. Let's maybe you can talk about what are top financial mistakes you're seeing tech employees make. I think you were kind of alluding to one where the executives were making more money than the rank and file, yet they still had more expenses and debt. So it feels like keeping up with the Joneses. But go ahead and go into your list.
I think that's a big one. I think particularly when you're joining one of these companies right out of college, it's very easy to immediately get yourself in this habit of, hey, I just graduated, I'm joining these companies, and now let me go and lease that new Tesla. I'm going to skip the Model 3 even. I'm going to go straight to the S. My compensation can cover it. And maybe I'm just getting a lease and adding that recurring expense, and that's something that I feel comfortable with. And then I'm adding in like, oh, let me go for that premium apartment in San Francisco because I've been living in a dorm before then. Time to kind of like live it up. I've worked hard. Now it's time for me to enjoy my spoils. And I think it's just getting into the habit of always immediately extending yourself, and immediately maxing out all of your
Mm.
spending to match kind of that income coming in, which is dangerous, particularly within tech, because the income can be variable when more and more of their compensation is coming from the stock grants that they're given, or the restricted stock units if they're at a public company. So if they get used to living off of the restricted stock units, and then the company that they're working for has a little bit of a stock correction, all of a sudden they're very
Hmm.
easily not just paycheck to paycheck, but kind of in the hole, because they got used to that higher level of spending that kind of went with that. So just the initial, it's very, again, that this is where you get the $250,000 a year person that's still living paycheck to paycheck. It's just those big recurring expenses that just kind of get you trapped.
That's true. I remember when Facebook stock went down, there were employees going to managers saying, "So, can we like get reimbursed for the stock?" I'm like, "Wait, what? Time out." When the stock was rallying like 100x, you weren't going back to the company saying, "We're making too much. Here you go." It's like, no, that's the risk of equity. So one is, spending above your means. It seems like.
Hmm.
So let's hear another one. You think you see
Yeah,
tech
I think
employees?
honestly, one is the just even knowing how much you get paid. Like you'd be surprised how many employees don't have any idea what their actual compensation is. I know you guys were both at Google, right? So you guys have really good
Hmm.
internal tools. I think it's like Go/Prosper that has amazing visuals of all of your compensation, exactly the current value of your equity, the exact
Yep.
projection of what your bonus will have will be when if it lands, assuming you get all of the usual performance standards. But again, a significant amount of that is equity, and you guys had the tooling to be able to visualize that. But most companies don't have that. So when more and more of your compensation is coming from equity, people are flying blind. I'll talk to people and they'll be like, "Oh, my total compensation is $180,000," and I'll kind of walk through everything with them and have them plug things into a spreadsheet that I made that essentially mimics what Prosper has. And all of a sudden I'm like, "Hey, you actually make $300,000. Did you even know that you make $300,000?" And like, "Oh, I had no idea." Or they're like, "Hey, I'm looking at my W-2 as I'm about to pay taxes on it. It said I made $300,000, but my salary is only 180,000. Like, what is this number?" And I have to
Hmm.
reiterate to them that, hey, like your RSUs are income, and it's getting taxed as income and treated like income, and it is income. You're just kind of ignoring it just because it lands to you in a different direction. So not knowing how much you actually get paid, which kind of goes into the next thing of not treating all income like income, because you're getting income from three different sources typically. One is going to be the base salary. Everyone's used to that. They're getting paid weekly, biweekly, biweekly being the most common, unless you're at Amazon in Seattle where you get paid monthly. But that kind of biweekly paycheck, you get used to that and very comfortable. And then you have maybe the annual bonus, maybe twice a year bonus that you kind of treat as like an extra amount. But
Hmm.
then again, the RSUs, the restricted stock units that we talked about, particularly when you're in a public company, from the IRS perspective, it's the exact same thing as if you were getting paid a cash bonus. It just kind of has this extra step. So people are just inherently treating their income differently and not realizing that, hey, RSUs is a significant portion of your compensation, and it is income. And that kind of goes to the next one where if you're not treating it like income, you might just be doing nothing with it. And what ends up happening is they end up with huge concentrated positions where all of a sudden, like 50% of the net worth is tied up to the stock in the company that they're actually physically working in right now. So it just ends up really, really overexposed to one company, and the entire success of
Hmm.
their own portfolio tied up to one company, and that being the same company that they work for, just can create a lot of problems. So one of the things I always try to tell people, and it's harder to land when the stock's continuing to go up and to the right. Like diversification is very popular when stocks are tanking, but when things are increasing by 100% in the year, particularly among what I think they're saying the Magnificent Seven, now among the top performers within the S&P 500, all within tech. It's hard to convince them that they should be diversifying because they've benefited so much for doing nothing.
Hmm.
But in actuality, every new vest that they receive, they should be asking themselves the question: if I received the same amount in cash, would I
Hmm.
use that cash to buy my company's shares? And
Mm,
oftentimes they'll try to justify one way or the other, and I'll be like, hey, particularly for Meta employees, they receive their Q1 vests at the same time they receive their annual bonus. So I'm like, hey, when you receive this bonus, do you have any plans on buying more Meta? And very, very, very
Hmm.
rarely will someone be like, yes, I'm definitely buying more. And it's like, no, I have enough exposure from my future RSUs, and I also have these ones that I've already vested that I've been holding on to. So I say, like, why? If that's the case, then why are you holding on to these ones? It's just a random arbitrary amount that's based off of an amount that was granted to you maybe when you first started at the company and has since appreciated. And if you want to be disciplined and actually hold on to even more of your company stock, that's perfectly fine. I'm just encouraging people to be try to be rational with it, and like maybe like write down like what percent of your overall net worth do you want tied to one company. And I think anything more than 5% is concentrated. More than 10% is like very concentrated. So once you get into the place where it's very easy, if you're ignoring it and you've worked somewhere for a while, to be into like the 50% plus, particularly if your company
Right.
stock has done really, really well.
Yeah, it's true. I think we all have the bomber fantasy of we just want to keep on concentrating, and
Developers.
And so-
Yes.
but it's good to get the diversification in there. So I think that leads to your next tip for tech employees.
Yeah, I think getting diversified. And it's not about, I think one of the things that prevents them from doing anything with it is that they don't have a plan for what they would do when they do sell or if they do diversify. So it's one thing that you don't treat it like income because you actually have to take an extra step in many cases. Like I think some places like Google will now allow you to auto sell automatically once it vests. But most places don't have that ability. So you have to physically go in and then sell. And yes, there's no additional taxes based on that amount. But if you have a plan for it afterwards, you kind of go in, sell it. Typically, if you sell it right after vest, there's going to be very little additional taxes owed because then the taxes are based off of the gains between when it actually vested and when you received it. And again, if you sell within right after receiving it, it should be pretty small within the first couple weeks. And then having a plan of what to do with it just makes you more confident in like, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to immediately diversify. And I'm a very boring investor. It's very much around like, hey, I've won the income game by being in tech and working there for so long. I can now be boring with all of my other investments. I don't need to be hitting home runs. I can just try to match the overall stock market. I've kind of accepted that I'm not smarter than everyone else. I've my individual stock picking abilities, I don't have any magical powers there. So I just buy very boring low fee index funds like VTI, which is the Vanguard's total market index fund with some of the lowest expense ratios out there, VXUS for the international side. And these are the Vanguard versions, but there's going to be Fidelity flavors, Schwab flavors. The main theme is boring, low fee index funds, just trying to match the overall market returns, which I think on average is 8 to 10% after inflation. It's not going to give you 8 to 10% every year. As we see in the last 2 years, I think the S&P 500 alone has been up 23% each year. But then the year before that, minus 18. But if you ended up doing the math, it ends up averaging out even those 3 crazy years right around that kind of like 8 to 10% range. It's funny how the geometric means kind of play that way. It's hard for us to kind of conceptualize.
Well said. So get diversification in there. Now, what if folks want to go into maybe investing in startups, real estate, other things like that? What's your other tips? Yeah.
My general approach has been to be boring with the vast majority of your investments. And if you want to be more speculative with a certain percent, like maybe like that 5 to 10%, like physically write down what you want that percent to be, just like you would if it's like concentration in one specific company. And if you want that 5 to 10% also to be ones that you're like personally involved in, and that could be anything from picking individual stocks to investing in startups to kind of, I put crypto in this category where just kind of like high risk bets that like they could go to zero, particularly with like both crypto as well as like angel investing. A lot of it's kind of like a numbers game, and particularly on the angel side, where if you're just doing a few checks, it's really hard to kind of really be successful. But if you're writing lots of checks, maybe it makes sense. But then it comes between a balance of how much of your overall net worth are you really tying up in these kind of like high risk, potentially going to zero assets. And that's where I get more comfortable personally on like, hey, be boring with most of it. And then with the rest, you can kind of be a little bit more speculative or kind of like treat it as money that as part of like your hobby balance.
Right. That's a good point. So I ran Google's real estate investment group. If Googlers are watching, go/real estate. We like grew to like 11,000 people, which was craziness. And people would ask me like what to do with your money. And I'd first say, max out your 401k, make sure you have emergency funds and whatnot. If you want to get into real estate, Vanguard's got these REITs, which are nice. And then if you want to try dip your toe in by getting a single family house maybe or a duplex, but don't go into something crazy out of state yet because you don't have experience and you don't know if you're going to like it or not. And then I think in Facebook, a real estate group was started, and then someone was putting together money, and it turned out to be like some type of scam or something. I heard about.
Yeah.
Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I know the story you're thinking of. Basically, the within tech circles, like what once you start paying a significant amount in taxes, one of the first things people start looking for is like, what are all the ways that I can save money on taxes? And then real estate is like one of the things that kind of pops up. Although there's some misconceptions there, but generally, there was an internal employee within the real estate group of everyone having excess capital and wanting to be doing something with it. And not necessarily just being boring about having it in the stock market. And real estate is, again, that's kind of like one of the stalwarts that plenty of successful people have made a lot of money with it. And like leverage is a hell of a drug. But they were collecting capital to kind of be that middleman to make it easy for everyone else. Like, hey, I'm on the side. I'm being a partner and like raising capital and going and buying like homes personally. And you guys can kind of like chip in. And I think the over time he ended up ghosting everyone and kind of like falling off the radar, and people lost like a significant amount of money from it. I think since then he's tried to come back. I've a couple friends that are in the like also in deep into the real estate side of things, but most of the people that invested with the original person, they lost their funds. So I think like chasing after returns and like looking for like speculative bets, particularly again, it's tough when it's like a coworker. Like that's where one of the reasons I think it was successful is because there's a lot of like built-in trust of like, hey, this guy is like within the walled garden. Like I can trust them. And then they kind of like utilize that and I don't know, potentially took advantage of people. I don't know all the specific details of that
Yeah,
specific one. I'm not someone that's super deep into the real estate side of things. So it's one where I'm like, a lot of this sounds like too good to be true. And I'm
right.
just going to like stick with my plan on these boring index funds. They never bother me or
Oh, exactly. It's everyone hears about how great real estate was,
yeah.
but people to put in context of like real estate imploded in
Yeah.
2008, 2009. And so just reversion to the mean, if you put anything into real estate in a decent area, you were going to do well.
Yeah.
But then once it became popular and huge, then the returns started going down and the shysters start getting into the market. And there's an expression of it's better not to shit where you eat. And so the fact that he had a gold mine of making it Facebook from that job, but then risked it all by pissing off all the
Yeah.
employees. I kept on telling tech employees like Larry and Sergey at Google created this wall garden of all these wonderful people in here, and so the trust component is very high. And if you take that trust component and go to real estate, which is like dog eat dog, zero sum game, you will be eaten alive.
Yeah.
So like dial up the skepticism meter. Now let's go to other tips you have for tech, other mistakes you're seeing tech employees make when it comes to their investings or financial planning or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last one on the real estate side that we can kind of go to now. The popular one is like short term rentals as like a way to offset your W-2 taxes. And I think it's just again, it's one where it's hard to scale, and I think there's a lot of people selling courses on how to save money on taxes by having short term rentals, and they're looking at it purely from the perspective of how do I save money on taxes, and they're not approaching it from a perspective of like, is this a good investment? And if that's a short-sighted way to look at things, like you shouldn't be getting into investments just to save on the taxes. The taxes can be a side effect of it, can be factored in, but rarely are you optimizing broadly if you're just focused on the tax side of things. So like chasing all of these little loopholes and things like that are ones where people get into trouble, or just like, again, like I think about it in terms of like return on hassle, where you're spending a lot of time on something to eke out maybe like a marginal increase in your tax savings, but you're spending so much time on it that, hey, like you probably are better off just like being better at your job than worrying about this like random side hustle because your income is like pushing 200K plus 300K, 500K. Why are you wasting your time on something that cash flows like $200 per month? It's not going to change your trajectory. It's wasting your time. And again, it's just like the ROI on time and hassle is just not there.
So true. The opportunity cost is huge. I told a lot of Googlers, like, you're just having this job as a lottery ticket and you're going to have a good retirement if you just stay employed and do well. Don't risk it by chasing these real estate dreams on the side. If anything, what's great is when the market does crash, by having this job and having the income, then you can start picking up deals. But there's going to be times in the market where just nothing's going on and you need to focus on your job and getting those stock refreshers, getting a promotion. That's where you're going to build your real wealth. So what about retirement savings?
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly within working at companies within Fang, like every single Fang company has amazing retirement accounts, like within the 401k. And people when they're talking about the 401k, they think kind of very narrowly, where it's like, oh, my 401k is just the maybe the pre-tax amount or up to the company match. And really, what a tech employee that's earning a large amount of income should be doing is making sure they really understand their plan. All of the FANG companies have what's called a plan that basically allows you to contribute up to $70,000 per year into it. And the way that it works is the first like $23,500 they can elect between pre-tax and Roth. And if you're in high incomes, particularly if you're in high income states like California and New York, where most tech employees find themselves, like the pre-tax option tends to be a good option because you save on the taxes immediately this year. You'll eventually pay taxes on it down the road when you're in retirement, but likely you'll be earning less money than you are when you're in peak tech earning years and able to save this amount of money. So saving at least that 23,500 pre-tax, and that will ensure that you get the full company match. And both Google and Meta around like the 11,500 ish range. But then there's this extra bucket that people aren't aware of, or they think is very complicated. I refer to it as like the mega backdoor Roth IRA because it's a fun, like sexy way to refer to it. But within your 401k plan, it would be referred to as an after-tax 401k contribution with an in-plan conversion option. And like it sounds complicated, so people kind of avoid it. Like, oh, that backdoor Roth or mega backdoor Roth sounds too complicated. I'm not going to mess with it. But in actuality, all it is logging into your 401k provider and going to the contribution screen and changing a percent. Like for Meta employees, I think Google employees. Yeah, it's like changing. It's like too much work to change a number in a field, and then maybe a drop down. So there's like an extra drop down within the Meta one where it's because by default it just goes into this after tax bucket, which is not super useful. But the drop down that says like convert after tax to Roth, that's where the magic happens, because now up to, again, like within Meta's plan, it's like $34,000 plus will now go into this after tax bucket. But if you have the in plan conversion setting turned on, that instantly turns into a Roth. And there's no other way for someone in a high income to put that much money into a Roth account, let alone in addition to the amount that they're already saving in the pre-tax category. So just within the retirement account, just within their employer retirement account, able to save $70,000 per year in tax advantage accounts, both split across pre-tax as well as after-tax or Roth with through the after-tax contribution. So
that's
again,
amazing.
The benefits of the companies are really good, and sometimes they sound complicated, but if you kind of just dig in a little bit and understand, then it's kind of like, I don't know, if you're going to be saving the money anyway for retirement, an option that people should definitely think about and look into.
Exactly. Good points. Last one. What about the situation of saving too much for retirement, eating ramen and hating your life?
I think it's a really good question. Particularly, so I'm there's like two people that I follow that I really like. One is like Bill Perkins, I believe, who wrote a book called Die with Zero, and the other one is Ramit Sethi, who just had a new book out, but he's originally known for like I think the name escaped me. Like
I Will Teach You to Be Rich.
There we go. There you go, Joe.
I Will Teach You to Be Rich, and he has a new one for Money for Couples. And the premise there is all around like Ramit Sethi refers to it as like your rich life. And then Bill Perkins refers to it kind of as making sure that you're like spending down your money and capitalizing on like experience dividends in the same way that you would be saving money for the appreciation. You would also be living your experiences in a way that it appreciates. Every single time that you look back on that ski trip that you took, it's kind of a additional memory dividend that you can kind of cash in. And also the concept of having bucket lists based on times of your life. So there's going to be certain experiences that are going to be more enjoyable in your 20s than they would be in your 50s. So like downhill skiing is a lot better when your knees are fully functioning and not going to be immediately sore after one run down when you're, say, in pushing your late 50s. So that shifts around from maximizing your income and maximizing your savings to like maximizing lifetime enjoyment and your lifetime utility and lifetime happiness. And I think it's a balance. I think within tech, if you're working at these companies, you're earning a high salary, but it can be a grind. You're not getting those high salaries for free. It's not because you're not putting in the sweat equity into it. And sometimes it's all about like, hey, what are the things that you could be doing and spending money on that makes it sustainable? So spending money on those things that makes it easier for you to stay in that job. Which is one of the things that I oftentimes push people when I'm talking to people. Half the time it's around encouraging them to spend more because like, hey, you're just burning yourself out. It's not going to do any good if you're grinding and not able to keep working there for the long run. And this is a big thing too, when you're talking about like Airbnbs or other side hobbies or side hustles. Like you're adding on to the grind and you're making it so much harder to like sustain that core moneymaker that you have, which is your tech job. So spend money on things now while you're living, to kind of like make it sustainable, make it enjoyable. And also one where don't have too much delayed gratification. Like I think there's like some value early on where you kind of have that like chip on your shoulder, or where you're continuing to spend like a college student for a little bit, but at a certain point, the marginal value of saving additional dollar isn't going to do anything. Like I was calculating at one point where like, what would happen if I doubled my travel budget from like, I don't know, like $10,000 to $20,000. And it sounds like a very large amount, like on paper, it's, oh, it's $10,000 more per year. But then I run the projections. I'm like, oh, that means I need to work an extra 1 week or 2 weeks. And I'm like, yeah, totally worth it. Like doubling my vacation budget for the rest of my life to work like 1 or 2 extra weeks within my big tech salary. That's a no brainer. And I think when people start conceptualizing it in that sense of like, hey, like if you did increase your budget within these categories, like what does that affect your long-term plans? And that's going to be
Yeah.
the same thing for like, hey, taking a lower paying job at like a startup, or taking like a year off sabbatical. Like really being able to understand like, what does that impact on your long-term goals? I think oftentimes, particularly when you're like mid-career or later, and you've done a really good job building up that foundation that gives you a lot of optionality later on, you have that flexibility, and you're kind of able to be like, hey, actually, it's not really going to affect my long-term goals if I do take this time off, or it will do it in a way that I'm willing to do it. Like maybe I'm willing to drop my like discretionary spending bucket by a little bit, because it will, but it'll let me take kind of that gap year off, or
Yeah.
different options there.
Exactly. I think dudes struggle with that the most. It's like work,
Yeah.
work, 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 and then die. And so
Yeah.
we, we don't we were not fully integrated in other
Yeah.
things about enjoying life and our experiences and whatnot. So, which we have 5 minutes, but Facebook just announced those layoffs or they're going to get rid of 5% of their low performers or whatnot. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what's going on here, because they've been just getting rid of people. Like last year they did layoffs, year before that,
Yeah.
and just hear what your thoughts are in this.
Yeah, no, I was part of the May 2023 layoffs, and that was, I think, number 4 in that year that happened. So I'm definitely fresh for me. And kind of going forward now too, it's like they just announced today, literally, that it will be around 5% ish. I think I'll be interesting to see. Like one thing is like right now is performance review season. Like so, the companies are already going through. So Meta has shifted to an annual performance review cycle, and people essentially get ratings right now. So you'll get anything from like meets some, meets most, which are going to be the negative ones, to meets all expectations at your level, exceeds expectations, greatly exceeds, redefines. And each of those typically have a bonus percent tied to them. And then if you get the negative ones, like maybe like a meets most is like the one under meets all, those would oftentimes lead up to a PIP, so a performance improvement plan, where you then need to partner with your manager would partner with their HR partner and set up a plan and outline and document exactly what someone needs to do to be able to get to make sure that they're operating at that current level. And what I'm reading in this current thing, I think the thing I'm looking for is like, is it a layoff? Which the layoff has some specific requirements, and like if you hit certain thresholds, and all of a sudden you're like subject to the Warren Act, which has some requirements amount of notice that they'll have to give people. And most of the time, these tech companies won't. They haven't been like what they'll do instead of the notice is just say like, hey, we're letting you go, but you're going to stay on the payroll for 60 days. Like, because the Warren Act, at least in California, is going to be 60 days. If you're in New York, it might be 90 days. But instead of like warning you ahead of time, they're just going to say you're laid off, but we're going to give you a severance of 60 days plus, even though that's what's required to kind of like to deal with the Warren Act thing. But if it's performance related, there's like a chance that they're not going through the full layoff process. And if they're bundling it in a certain way around like within the performance review cycles that they're doing, like it's possible that it's not going to be like a traditional layoff. They're just kind of trying to skip the performance improvement plan, and they're kind of like going into like year of intensity mode, or even more, and being like, hey, we don't want to have this drawn out process. We want to accelerate it. So maybe this, in most cycles where you get a meets most or most years, there's sometimes a automatic like, hey, performance improvement plan in place, and there's like a chance that you can kind of stay. And maybe now they're kind of being more aggressive, like, hey, we're not going to do that. We're just going to immediately go in and potentially lay people off. Again, this is speculative, and I'm waiting to see what happens. Like right now, over the next month, is when the managers at Meta are going to be in performance meetings and kind of be determining these ratings and doing calibrations. So I think that's going to be going out of that thing. And again, like some of this is natural. Like part of the performance plan, performance cycles has been more strict around like certain percents of teams needing to or make sure that managers are having like, hey, make sure at least 10% of your team is within meets most territory, or like a non-regrettable attrition bucket. So this could just be a reinforcement of that and kind of shortening of that follow-up cycle if you do get a negative review.
Gotcha. Joe, the meets most, was that kind of like a kiss of death at Facebook? Like what was the future prospects of an employee getting promoted from that? And if you got meets most, was it better just to start looking around for other places to work?
There were a couple unusual situations, but you could imagine someone getting meets most once, and then in the next cycle they would start to improve. But if they got it multiple cycles in a row, it would usually be an automatic performance plan or asking the person to leave. You could also imagine someone getting like a monster promotion. And then if they got a meets most in the next cycle, people would sort of say, well, they're getting adjusted to this new role or a new level. And so it's reasonable that they got a low score. I mean, you saw similar things at Google, right? That was sort of in the early days, there was a rule of thumb that if you got promoted, your next performance review would be horrible, right? Mm-hmm. And so people were just prepped for it. But I think generally all these companies use it as a kind of a warning to the employee, and you don't want to see it 2 times in a row.
Yeah, now I think like in the last couple of years, before they had more frequent performance cycles where they had it twice a year, and now it's one official one. But there's still like a mid-cycle one where there's kind of like a lighter weight version of like on track or not. I don't remember the specific terminology, but that's kind of how they're doing it. So I think if they got a not on track kind of going into this one, it's a little bit more of a it's just heavier than it had been in the past. It's kind of my read.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Well, thank you very much for sharing. And Andre, thank you for joining our show. Y'all should check out his Substack. It's fangfire.com. He's got like almost 19,000 subs. And also follow
right under 20,000. I should be able to hit that in within the next 2 days.
I can't wait.
Put you over the top.
Exactly. So thank you, Andre, for joining. And thank you all for watching. Thank you for supporting the show. We'll be back on Tuesday and talk to you all later. Andre, stay on for 1 second. Andre, thanks for joining us. If you'd like to watch the rest of our hour-long bonus episode where we talk about AI research papers and other topics, go ahead and hit the join button or go to patreon.com/SVIC. If you like what you're watching, this is the Silicon Valley Investors Club podcast. Feel free to hit like and subscribe and check out these videos over here. Thanks.